45 tonight. We left off where Joseph had revealed himself to his brothers after the time of sending them back and forth, and the tests that he wanted to see whether or not their character had changed over the years since he last saw them. And he realized that it had. And he finally revealed himself to them and told them who he was. And of course, they were astonished. Here's their brother that they last saw being sold as a... They were the ones that sold him. And they had given him up as dead however long ago it had been. And now 13, 14, 15 years later, here he is, the ruler in Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. And he is the one that they've got to others. And we spent a lot of time last week talking about how all that Joseph had been through and the ordeals that he had endured did not cause him to become bitter. Okay? He was happy to see his brothers. He was rejoicing to have their family again. And also, as we'll see tonight, he was eager to share with them the blessings that God had provided to him. Okay? He was not being selfish. He was eager to share with them the blessings that God had provided him. So we're going to pick up this evening in Genesis chapter 45 with verse 8, Reverend 8. Now it was not you, this is Joseph speaking to his brothers. Now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh. This is a portion that we read last week. He hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Haste ye, go up to my house, to my father, and say unto him, Thus saith Joseph, thy son, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, tarry not, and thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast, and I will nourish thee, for there are yet 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. And behold, your eyes shall see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that is my mouth that speaketh unto you, that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. And you shall tell my father of all the glory of Egypt and of all that you have seen, and you shall make haste and bring down my father thither. So Joseph realized that the blessings of God that had been provided through him in Egypt, flocks, come on down, you can settle there. Okay? Verse 16, coming down a little bit. It says, the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come. And it pleased Pharaoh well, and his servants. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Say unto thy brethren, This do ye, lade your beasts, and go and get your father and your households, and come unto me. And I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat of the fat of the land. So Pharaoh was very happy. Okay, to hear that Joseph's family was coming down. It says in verse 20, also regard not your stuff for the good of the land of Egypt, land for the flocks and for all the abundance that it would provide for them while they stayed there. Pharaoh was thrilled at the idea. When he heard that Joseph's family came down and that his brothers were going to come down there to live there and that his dad was going to come down to live there, Pharaoh said, hey, that's wonderful. Don't worry about any of your stuff and how you're going to get it. I'll send a caravan up there to bring you and all your stuff down. So Pharaoh provided all of the moving expenses. Okay, Pharaoh made it happen. Joseph provided them with a whole caravan to move everything they owned down to Egypt. It says in verse 25, they went up out of Egypt and Cain. Jacob last heard 50 years ago that Joseph was dead, that he was torn to pieces by a wild beast in the wilderness, and that his brothers didn't do anything to stop it. Okay? And now not only is Joseph alive, it would have been enough for him to hear that Joseph is alive and still a slave in Egypt. He would have gone down there and bought it back. Okay? But not your character and to prove yourselves. Tell him of the splendor of Egypt. Tell him about the 7 years of plenty and then the 7 years of famine and about how God did all of this. Tell him about everything. Just they told him all the words of Joseph, which when he had said unto them, When he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. And listen, as the Bible says, this is the Lord's work. And is it marvelous in our eyes? There are things that happen that just cannot be possible. And that's how Jacob's response was to this news that Joseph was, first of all, alive, and second of all, ruler over the whole land of Egypt. He fainted. His heart fainted. It didn't even seem real to him. And then his brothers started up for this important task.
All right.
And he said, I guess if this is all happening, why would all of these folks come up out of Egypt if my boys were just making up a story?
There you go.
He said, only God can do this. Experiences with God to know that God can do great things.
Sure.
Remember, Jacob was the one that wrestled with God and said, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And Jacob knew what God could do because he'd seen God up at the top of a ladder and the angels ascending and descending, and said, I know God's involved in my life. Jacob knew that God just because he thought his son Joseph was dead. And now God is showing him, hey, look, I've still been involved with Joseph. You thought he was dead, but I've still been doing things for him, and now I'm going to bring you back together.
Yes.
Praise God. Chapter 46, verse 1. And Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down, and when you die, Joseph's going to be there. You didn't live to see Joseph's death, but Joseph will be there when you die. And Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, and all their little ones, and their wives, and their wagons, which Pharaoh sent to carry him. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him, and his sons, and with him, and their daughters, and the sons' daughters, and all the seed, and they brought them into Egypt. And then from there on, it goes to list the names of all of the sons, and the sons, and everybody that came with them into Egypt. But we see here at the beginning of chapter 46 that Jacob offered a sacrifice to honor God, and God told him, look, everything that I said I was going to do, I do. Just because you thought you lost one of your sons, and you thought that some part of the promise had been cut off, Jacob, I'm still God, and now I'm still bringing it to pass. Jacob, don't lose hope in God when everything in the world seems to be being pulled this way and that way. God is still God.
Yes, sir.
God is still God. And like we said, the rest of chapter 46 just names the names of all of those that come down into Egypt with Jacob, the families. Coming ahead to chapter 47, verse 1. Then Joseph came. This is when they get into Egypt. Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, What is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, Thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said moreover unto Pharaoh, For to sojourn here in the land are we come. For thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. In that, and if thou knowest any man of activity among them, make them rulers over my cattle. Okay, so just as Pharaoh had put all of Egypt under Joseph's authority, he's also giving the best of the land now to Joseph's family. He's putting the best of Egypt at the disposal of Joseph's family. Okay, it's not just saying, oh yeah, we got a patch of land over here. If you read about Goshen, it was the best of the land. It was absolutely the best of the land. It was where the Nile drained, and it was well watered, and crops grew there in abundance. Okay? And the people were shepherds. And to the Egyptians, shepherding was not a noble occupation. So when Joseph's brothers told Pharaoh that they were shepherds, he allowed them to have the best of the land that was suitable for grazing the animals, and he also gave them command over his own flocks of cattle. So just as Pharaoh had put Joseph over all of the wealth of the land of Egypt and over all of the governance of the land of Egypt, so that he could deal with it wisely as he had wisely interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, now he's putting Joseph's family, who are shepherds by trade, over his own flocks to deal with them wisely, to raise them up wisely, and so that they would multiply, even as we saw Jacob in Haran with his father-in-law's flocks and being blessed and multiplying and treating them well. But that doesn't mean that they were just working and laboring and they weren't slaves yet in Egypt. Okay, that's going to come in a few generations when a Pharaoh rises up that doesn't know Joseph. But it means that they had all of it at their disposal. Okay?
Right.
Even as Paul would write later to the Corinthians, he asks a question and he uses it to set an example for a different purpose, but he asks the question, who feedeth the flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock?
Right.
He uses a true example of those who labor at a flock, caring for it, rearing it, providing for it, watching over it, that yes, they do have access to what the flock provides, which is food, which is, the leather of the animals, the wool of the animals, the milk of the animals. He said they have access to it. And Pharaoh says, let them guard over my flock in the best of the land, and Pharaoh's flocks were the best in the land. So Pharaoh set Joseph over everything, and he put the best of Egypt, his own personal flocks, at the disposal of Joseph's family. Look how God provided.
Yes.
Look how God provided. Why? Because Joseph was faithful to God. Because in all that Joseph endured, he never became bitter. He never got a bad attitude. Because in all of those 13 years where he was a slave, where he was in jail, he never got a bad attitude. He never resented his brothers. Maybe there were private times of prayer where he cried out to God and said, why am I going through this? But whenever he had to deal with another person, whenever he had to face the problems, his willingness to endure without bitterness. His whole family was blessed. He didn't begrudge his brothers. Joseph did not begrudge those 11, not Benjamin, he wasn't involved, but he didn't begrudge those 10 older brothers who mistreated him. Brothers who sold him as a slave. He didn't begrudge them the benefits of his own exaltation. He said, hey, here I am. But what God has done for me, he didn't mean it just for me. Because Joseph himself, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. All of these things that Jesus say a person is blessed for, Joseph exemplifies. Merciful, pure in heart, a peacemaker with a pure heart before my God. When Joseph would have turned things around and in his position of authority now gone out with a vengeance against his brothers, he said, I'm going to be the cause of peace here. He was a peacemaker. And back those years ago when he was thrown into a pit, persecuted, they came through Pharaoh. Pharaoh's the one that said, yes, give your family the very best that we have to offer here in Egypt. The blessing was from God. And we've discussed this also before, where it says in James chapter 1, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father. Okay? God might provide it through different sources, but as long as we're honest, okay? Because some people will rob a man's mind and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. You don't have to worry about counting it or taking inventory. He said, it's all mine. It's all mine. So when Pharaoh said, you can have the best of my flocks, they already knew it was God's to begin with.
Yes.
Okay? Coming down a little bit further in Psalm chapter 50, God says again, call on me. He said, why are you calling on me now when every time I offer something to you in truth, You despise it. You despise it. He said, when thou sawest a thief, thou contentest with him, and hast been partakers with adulterers. You make excuses for doing things wrong when it's convenient for you. You can eat of all the trees. Don't eat of that one over there. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And what's the only one we read about them eating from? That one. Okay? But they could have had any of them.
Yes, sir.
How do we get it? If it's God's and he says we can have whatever we need from him, then how do we get it from him? We get it from him. We get the blessings. We get the desires of our hearts from him the same way Joseph did and the same way Jacob did. They both lived long lives and they both suffered many things. Jacob learned some lessons the hard way, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. When we look at Jacob, when we look at Joseph, whether they were suffering wrongly or whether they were learning from their own hard, bad choices, when they get something from God, why is it? It's because what they want from God is what will glorify God in the desires of our heart. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee desires of our heart. The desires need to be delightful to the Lord. Okay? When we ask of God for the things that we want, do we have faith in those? Or are we doubtful of it? Okay? And are we faithful in our lives, in how we live for God? Or are we in live who's living for God today, going back a little bit tomorrow, going forward a little bit today, going back a little bit tomorrow, not because they're always falling to temptation and saying, as the Bible says that the righteous man stumbles, because they just haven't committed themselves to God. God says, look, you need to get yourself committed to me. Then I'll help you stay solid in the way that you live. I'll help you stay faithful. And then in that commitment and in that faithfulness, I'll bless you more and more each day as you remain. In James chapter 4, coming down a little bit further, he said, you ask and you receive, not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts. Because so many times those people that are living that phony life, that double-minded life, just but are really meant to only boost themselves up in their ego, boost themselves up in their own personal comfort, boost themselves up so they can make something for themselves, but not really do anything to benefit God. Now, Joseph certainly was comforted. Joseph certainly had a nice house. Ask for those things that he could consume it upon his own lusts.
There you go.
When he was in the position to help others, he used his position to help others. Now listen, we ask for God sometimes, and we say, maybe I shouldn't have asked for that. We ask for God sometimes, and we say, well, now that Pastor's talking about this, I wonder if I've been asking the right things or wanting the right things or considering what we've asked for. We say, have I barely been asking that because it's just something that I want? I've asked for God things that I wanted, and he's given it to me, and I didn't even tell anybody else. I just remember thinking that it would be nice, and perhaps you think that you've sinned because you've asked for something that's wrong. You've asked for something that God didn't want you to have, and you think that, oh, I've got to repent of that. No. If God doesn't want you to have it, he won't give it to you.
That's right.
Okay? It doesn't mean, but it does mean that you've got to accept his will. Okay? It's like a kid. If you think of a 5-year-old and they see their mom making a wonderful big birthday cake, and it's got all the frosting on there, and it's the flavors that they like, and it's decorated beautifully, and mom makes this cake and sets it. Mom knows it's going to make them sick.
Yes, sir.
They're never going to want to look at cake again. Mom also knows, no, you can't have that cake tonight. And the kid gets a little bit upset. But mom also knows that the cake's going to be a lot. That kid's friends are there the next day. Okay? So sometimes God just says, well, what you want is a good thing, but you got to wait for my time for it.
Yes, sir.
And if I give it to you all at once, it's not going to mean as much if you wait until later. If you get it all at once, it's not going to mean as much if you ruin it, spoil it all right now, then it just isn't God's will at all. Again, it doesn't mean that we were wrong for asking, but it does mean that we need to accept his will. Okay? Even Jesus asked for something that he wasn't given. When Jesus was in the garden praying before he went to the cross, it says that he went in a little bit further and fell on his face praying and said, "O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." He said, God, if there's any way that the redemption of mankind can be done with us.
That's right. Say it.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
Jesus knew the suffering that he would have to go through, and he wasn't looking forward to it. In the book of Hebrews, it says that he endured the cross, despising the shame.
Yes, he did.
But it was for the joy it means that it was for the joy that would come afterwards, not for the joy of the cross. You know the word excruciating? People talk about excruciating pain that they go through. You know what that word means? It comes from Latin. It means ex, means out of, cruce, the cross. The pain of a crucifixion was, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. So this shows us that it's not sin. If we've asked for something that just wasn't meant for us, or even that wasn't necessarily good for us, if we would have received it, it's not sin that we asked for it, as long as we accept God's will when he says no. Don't argue against God. Don't rebel against him and go about it our own way, but just accept God's will. That's conforming to God's will. That's living a true sacrificial life for him. Okay? That's what it means, okay, to live for God. He said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few. He said, I'm still a young guy. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my father in the days of his pilgrimage. He said, my dads were even older than me. My grandfather was even older than him. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and he went out from before Pharaoh. Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph nourished his father and his brethren, God in a position of authority, who was Joseph. Pharaoh provided the best that he had to the people of God, okay? But Pharaoh was still a man that worshiped the sun. Pharaoh was still a man that worshiped all of these false gods of Egypt, okay? But we see that he was providing for Joseph's family. Now, it might have been in a way that it was because he knew Joseph was doing good for his people. But nevertheless, he was doing good for God's people. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And God blesses those who treat his people right.
That's right. Amen.
Okay?
Amen.
You see that in workplaces. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. This was not the Pharaoh of Exodus who would come a couple hundred years later. Okay? The Pharaoh who came up later that didn't know Joseph, the Bible tells us in Exodus, and he began enslaving the Israelites. Okay? Chapter 47, verse. Joseph continued to rule over Egypt during the rest of the time of famine. He made Pharaoh very wealthy. He made Pharaoh extremely wealthy in the nation, and he made the nation of Egypt very powerful through the sale of food that he continued to save up for them through those years of plenty, the 147 years. It's old. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called Joseph and said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight. This is Jacob talking to Joseph, said, if I have found grace in your sight, I pray thee, put thy hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt and bury me as thou hast said. So Jacob, very near the end of his life, asked that he not be buried in Egypt, but to be taken to that cave where Abraham and the others had been buried. Chapter 48, as you read through that, you see that Jacob, while he was blessing them, he placed his right hand on the head of the younger and his left hand on the head of the older, meaning that the greater blessing would go to the younger, and the blessing, but the lesser blessing would go to the elder. But remember that when you read it, you see that Joseph tries to correct him and switch his hands around on him. Mm-hmm. And Jacob said, I know what I'm doing here. But remember that Jacob himself was the younger of the two children, and he got the greater blessing from God. So I just wonder if there was a little bit of him saying, that's not. he said, I know what I'm doing here. And he put his hand on the younger one's head and blessed him. But his blessing was that Ephraim and Manasseh would each multiply so greatly that they would be counted as each one of them their own tribe of people. And he counted both of Joseph's sons as his own, rather than as remembering, hey, I had that encounter with God. And you could say that he never walked the same again after that. But it was just a perpetual reminder for him, hey, I might walk a little bit funny, but I know something that everybody else doesn't know. I know that God is real. I know that God gets involved in people's lives. And I know that God changes lives. Just chapter 40, he says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. And unto him shall be the gathering of the people be. This is prophesying not only that Judah would be the royal tribe of Israel, and we see coming down to the tribe from which the Messiah would come.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Jacob here is prophesying of the Messiah who would come. Not just that the Messiah would come, but that he would come from the tribe of Judah. Okay, and coming down to the end of chapter 49, verse 29, it says, he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave of the Hittites, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the cave in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. And they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, and there I buried Isaac and Rebekah to go. Just knowing that it's our time, having all our loved ones there with us, and saying, all right, I'll see you when we all wake up together.
Yes, sir. All right.
My goodness, the death of Jacob right there. He asked Joseph, I don't want to be buried here. It was enough that I could see you before I die, but don't bury me here. And Joseph's going to make the same request. When we get to the end of chapter 50, he'll ask that he knows that he's going to be buried because his family is still in this through all of these generations that we're reading about from the beginning and even unto our day. Help us, God, through this example of faithfulness that we've seen in so many lives, also live in this faithfulness ourselves. Let our desires, and if you